Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Daniel Romero. He is an associate professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. He received his PhD in applied math from Cornell University, working with John Kleinberg, a fan of him. And he has an undergrad and grad degrees from Arizona State University, also in math and applied math. Daniel's main research interest is in the empirical and theoretical analysis of social and information networks. He is particularly interested in understanding the mechanisms involved in network evolution, information diffusion, and interactions among people on the web and in complex networks. So with that, please join me in welcoming Daniel. Please, Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi everyone, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, so let me see. Let me start by trying to share my screen. Yeah, I'd like to talk about some work that I've been doing recently with collaborators at Northwestern and at Michigan. So Agnes Horvat, Soyeon Huang, and Hao Peng, who's was my former student, who's now at Northwestern. So all those folks are at Northwestern, and then Misha Teplitsky, who's at Michigan. And so the topic of the talk is about public dissemination of science. And the first thing I want to argue is that this really matters. Like, it's really important for us to push our findings to the kind of public sphere and for the public to hear about it, because this is how our results can have impact, and this is how science can have more credibility. And also, a lot of the science that we do is funded publicly, so people have the right to benefit and to hear about all of these findings, right? And in that process, I argue that online spaces are very, very important, both from the consumer side and the producer side. So from the consumer side, people are more and more getting their news, both scientific and non-scientific news, on the web. And so from the consumer side, this is very important. And also from the production side. So scientists are increasingly promoting their findings online as well. And so the work that we've been doing has been trying to look at various aspects of this dynamics of dissemination of science on the web. So looking at things like how much attention we pay to potentially problematic papers, looking at things like disparities in who gets attention and who doesn't get attention and why, who self-promotes and who doesn't self-promote and why. And also looking a little bit about the content that gets disseminated. Is the content similar to what the original paper said, or does it deviate as time goes by? And so I want to talk about 3 different studies, and we'll see how we do with time. But the goal is to get through these 3 in some level of detail. So the first one is a paper that looks at attention to retracted papers, and also the effect that the retractions have on the attention that we pay to these papers. So this was a paper that was published a couple months ago in PNAS. Then the second one is about gender disparities in who decides to self-promote, who decides to go out and tweet about their papers after they publish them. This is currently under review, but there's a preprint that you can look at if you're interested. And then finally, I'll get in maybe less detail on this one, but also we'll at least talk about it to some extent, work that we did on information retention and the sharing of science when you look at multiple platforms like news and Twitter and so on. So does information kind of deviate from the original source, or does it kind of stay pretty close to it, right? And so that's the kind of plan for the talk. So let me jump into the first one. So the first one is about retractions and attention we pay to retracted papers and the impact of retractions. And so just to motivate a little bit, of course, retraction is a very important tool we have in science to kind of correct the record, but we don't know a whole lot about the effect that it has on the attention that we pay to papers, or even, I guess we know a little bit about, how much attention we pay to papers that will eventually be retracted, but we don't know a whole lot about that kind of general topic, the interaction between retractions and online attention to papers. And so this is kind of what the paper is trying to explore. And we're going to ask 3 sort of main questions. The first one is, are these retracted papers more or less popular than non-retracted papers? And again, thinking about multiple platforms, does it vary? If we ask a question in the news outlets versus social media versus Wikipedia and so on. Also, our retracted papers share more critically than non-retracted papers. So even before they get retracted, is it the case that the discussions already, you can tell that there's some issue with the paper because people are bringing up all kinds of flags about the paper. And then finally, and perhaps the most important question to some extent is whether retraction has an effect in reducing the attention that we pay to this paper. So once the paper is retracted, do we kind of move on and stop sharing the results of this paper because now we know that there's some type of issue with it? And so in order to do this work, again, we have to sort of match multiple data sets in order to answer the question. So we need the kind of data about the papers, but we also need data that is going to tell us what papers got mentioned and what didn't. And also, because we're interested in this question of critical versus non-critical attention, we also need to get into the actual content of the mentions. So we're going to use two main data sets, Allmetric and Retraction Watch. So let me say a little bit about each of them. So Allmetric is a company that basically tracks online attention to a large number of papers. You might be already familiar with it if you're kind of in the space. And the nice thing about it, or at least for us, the thing that's super useful is that it tracks attention in very different sources, right? So it looks at things like social media, like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and so on. But it also looks at news outlets, blogs, Wikipedia, and so on. So you can compare if there are differences across different platforms, which I think is a very important question. And then, so what we do is we look at this Allmetric data. We access it in 2019. The data actually starts in 2011. And we track mentions to 26 million academic papers. And for this, we're going to focus on English posts. Future work can and should look at non-English posts as well. And for each paper, we have a certain amount of metadata that we can use to match it with the Retraction Watch data. So things like title, the journal, DOI, publication date, the type of article, etc. And then we are going to track mentions in all of these different platforms, but we're going to be kind of thinking about four main types of platforms: social media, news media, blogs, and knowledge repositories, which is mostly Wikipedia, but other things like it. And then additionally, we're going to create a list of 27 news outlets that are going to represent the top news outlets. And so this is to compare kind of like all news media to those that are kind of very heavily curated to see if there are differences in how much they cover retracted papers. And then Allmetric gives us tells us who tweeted and when, but it doesn't actually give us the content of the tweet. So for that, we have to go out and separately collect the tweets from Twitter, and we're able to do this for 90% of them. The idea is that things that have been deleted since then we don't have access to. So we have access to about 90% of them. And then for the Retraction Watch database, this is an initiative that looks at basically retracted papers, and it collects a bunch of metadata about these papers. So it contains 21,000 papers have been retracted by 2020, which is the data we use. And it also has metadata that allows us to kind of match it with Allmetric. For this, we excluded papers that were published before the launch of Allmetric for obvious reasons, and also papers that don't have a DOI since they're much harder to match. And so we end up studying 4,210 papers that are in both databases. And so now, because we want to make statements about things between sort of retracted and non-retracted papers, in order to kind of make that comparison fair, we're going to construct a control set of papers that are going to be very similar in different dimensions to the retracted papers. And so the way we're going to do this is for each retracted paper, we're going to match it with 5 non-retracted papers that are very similar. And similar in what way? Well, they're going to be published in the same venue as a retracted paper. So for many cases, this controls to some extent controls the sort of research area of the paper because they're in the same venue. There are some exceptions to this, of course. They're published within 2 years of each other. They have a similar number of authors. They have a similar number of citations of the authors. And so this helps us kind of compare, to some extent, apples to apples and control for other potential confounds that might impact how much these papers get mentioned. And so in this in matching process, we're not able to find matches for every single retracted paper. So we only do so for 3,851 retracted papers, which is a 90% coverage of all of our retracted papers. Okay, so on to the first question. So are retracted papers more popular than non-retracted papers? And the answer is yes. So if we look at the different platforms, so each plot here is a different platform, and the yellow here is the retracted and the black is the control, we can see that there's definitely consistent differences where retracted papers, tend to get more attention. And what's interesting here is that this holds, for social media, but it also holds for news media or even top news media, which again are platforms that you would imagine are a bit more careful in what they cover, because they're more sort of curated, and we still see that like the difference there as well. Now, one thing that, of course, you immediately may think of here is that, well, attention is fine, but that not all attention is positive, right? So maybe a lot of these posts are just raising flags that are just saying, hey, there's something wrong with this paper, which is just not the same thing as promoting the findings of the paper. And so what we want to do is we want to sort of remove that critical attention and then compare to see if the non-critical attention still has that dynamic where the retracted papers get mentioned more. And so that's where we kind of have to go into the content of the tweets, and actually this analysis is going to be separately only for Twitter, because for multiple reasons that I can't get into, but let me just kind of explain how we do it. So we're going to look at each tweet, and we're going to define a critical tweet to be some tweet that is expressing doubt or skepticism or concern about some aspect of the paper, whether it's the data, the credibility, the novelty of the contribution, the different scientific elements, some type of criticism. And so what we do is we combine lexicons that we construct that have certain critical words and also manual labeling. So we get multiple annotators to tell us whether they think a particular tweet has been critical or not to the paper. And we get a pretty good agreement score between the annotators. And so we're able to identify, we think, all or most of the critical attention to these papers, both the retracted ones and the control, of course. And so at least on Twitter, when we then remove that sort of critical attention that is given to the paper, we still see that difference. The retracted papers are still getting more non-critical attention than the retracted papers are getting more non-critical attention than the non-retracted papers. So the first finding is, yes, retracted papers tend to get more attention, even in highly curated platforms, and even after removing mentions that are critical of the paper. The second question is, do retracted papers get more critical attention, right? So this is a different question, right? So before we said, let's take the non-critical attention and compare that. Now let's ask for each paper, you can measure what fraction of the attention it's getting is critical, and now we can compare that between the retracted and non-retracted papers. So when we do that, we see that actually retracted papers do get a higher fraction of critical attention than non-retracted papers, which tells us that, even before these retractions come in, these discussions on Twitter again, these discussions on Twitter are already kind of capturing some problems with the paper, which makes us wonder whether these discussions could help us improve the efficiency of the retraction process, which is something that is going to come up later in the talk as something potentially important to do. And so this is not something we kind of solve in this paper. This is kind of definitely an area for future work, because of course, retraction, shouldn't be rushed or anything like that. But it is interesting that we already can see that the online discussions are capturing some of those issues. Those flags are being raised. Okay, and so then for the final question, is the retraction effective at reducing the attention of the paper? And so for this, we're going to compare the mentions of the retracted paper 6 months before and 6 months after the retraction. And here we're going to exclude mentions that are simply discussing the retraction itself. So what tends to happen is that when a paper gets retracted, there's a little bit of a bump in terms of the mentions of the paper, but much of that bump is sort of saying, hey, this paper got retracted, which is good, but it's not what we're trying to see here. What we're trying to see here is that do people continue to kind of sort of spread the non-critical attention to the paper, or is that reduced by the retraction? And so here is the plot. So we can see, again, different platforms. And here the dashed line is 0. That's when the retraction occurs. And then we're looking at 6 months before the retraction and 6 months after. And what you can kind of see across the board is that the difference between retracted and non-retracted papers is already non-significant right before the retraction occurs. So what this tells us is that this question of whether or not the retraction is effective at reducing attention, the answer is no, for the simple reason that by the time the retractions come, the attention to the papers has been exhausted already. So people have more or less moved on, and now the control and the retract papers are kind of indistinguishable from each other. The amount of attention is already very low for both. And you can do we run like interrupted time series analysis to confirm that, statistically, there doesn't seem to be an effect on attention by this retractions. And so the retractions come too late. So that's the first paper, and I'm going to wait until the end to kind of talk more about like the kind of takeaways of these findings. But for now, let me move on to the second paper, which is on the gender disparities in scholarly self-promotion. Again, this is under review, but there's a preprint available if you're interested. So the motivation for the paper is that there's been work, actually it's paper by my co-author, Agnes Horvat, Northwestern, that shows that there are gender disparities in the online attention to scholars' work, right? So this plot here shows the fraction of male versus female scholars who are present in Allometric. And so, the male share is much larger. Of course, this is in part driven by the fact that there are more papers authored by males than females, in different areas. There's some variation, but across the board is much higher. So this doesn't necessarily tell us that there's disparity in terms of the attention that we're paying to them. But if you compare the fraction of women who are in Allometric versus the fraction of women who write papers, so this is by the fraction of women who are in the Web of Science, you see that there is a disparity. So they're less represented in Allometric than they are kind of in the Web of Science. And so part of the motivation here is like, well, we need to figure out like what explains these disparities and what are ways that we can use to try to close the gap, right? And so we thought that self-promotion could be one of them. So we thought that perhaps self-promotion could help explain some of these gender disparities. So if there are differences in self-promotion, that could sort of get amplified and then lead to these types of gaps. And of course, it wouldn't be the only thing that is impacting this, but it could be one potential. And so we're going to ask 2 research questions here. The first one is there gender difference? Are there gender differences in how scholars choose to self-promote their work and the frequency at which they do so? And then the next question is going to be about whether women and men get the same benefit out of self-promotion. So what we thought was that maybe if women are getting less out of self-promoting, so when they self-promote, the total amount of attention they get is lower than when men self-promote, then there's less of an incentive for women to self-promote, and that may explain why there might be differences in self-promotion, right? On the other hand, if there are no differences in the benefit, and there are differences in the rate of self-promotion, then closing the self-promotion gap could help close the kind of total attention gap, right? And so we want to look at whether there are differences in the kind of return on investment of self-promotion. Okay, our hypothesis is that women will tend to self-promote less than men, and there are kind of multiple both theoretical and empirical reasons for us to think so. The first one, from the kind of theoretical side, there's the backlash effect for behaviors that are not kind of consistent with gender stereotypes. And one of them may be that, as a woman, you don't self-promote as much. There's also self-stereotyping and the fact that there are fewer role models in science and media. And so these can also lead to kind of lower rates of self-promotion by women. There's also empirical studies that show that in other things that are related to self-promotion, like, for example, how much people cite their own papers, or how people talk about their own papers and talk about the importance of their own papers, there are gender differences in these cases as well. So again, empirically, it seems like that would be the kind of trend, right? And so that's our hypothesis. And so let's now look at the data. So again, we use allometric data, and here we're going to use 1.2 million papers published in 2018. We're going to focus on Twitter here. To some extent, that's okay because Twitter accounts for 92% of all mentions in social media. And so while we're missing others, this is kind of the bulk of it. And so what we do is we look at a paper. So this is like our retraction paper. And here are the authors in L-metric. And then we can see who tweeted this paper. And so here's my former student, Hao Peng, who's self-promoting this paper. And so we do this kind of matching of the names in the paper as well as the kind of name in the Twitter account. And this is a messy process because this matching is complicated. Of course, as you can imagine, people use different names, or sometimes they use something that's not their name. Sometimes we have to look at the handle instead of the name. So excuse me, we have some sort of heuristics that we use to do this matching properly. And I won't get into the details of that. It's not that interesting. But we do achieve an F1 of 0.97 based on manual verification. So we think we can do this matching pretty well. Okay, so that's for the name for the matching of authors and users on Twitter. And what about for the gender, right? So for this, we are going to use a off-the-shelf method that basically predicts the gender of a particular name based on national statistics. And it provides 4 possible categories. It could say it's female, it could say it's male, it could say it's unisex. That's for names that are used for both genders. And it also could say that it's unknown if it doesn't have enough kind of data to make a prediction. Here, so for the analysis, we're going to focus on male and female. We're going to, for the most part, throw out these 2, but when we add them as sort of controls as well, we don't get different results. We get similar results. Of course, the big limitation here is that we are only using 2 genders, and of course, they're non-binary genders, which we just don't have the data to analyze, and so that's like definitely area for important future work. For this paper, we only focus on male and female, so certainly a limitation. Now, for the male and female question, we do use, we validate the method using self-reported gender data, where it's a different database where authors have self-reported their gender, and we show that it performs pretty well in that data set, with some caveats. Like, for example, it doesn't perform really well in certain geographic areas, and so we have to kind of be careful with those. But in general, it performs pretty well. Okay, so of course, like before, there are all kinds of possible compounds that could come up that could explain why people choose to self-promote or not. And so we expand our data by looking at Microsoft Academic Graph and Web of Science to expand the metadata we have about the authors. And so we look at a paper and we look at other things like the number of authors. For each person, we look at the authorship position. So it matters if you're last, first, or if you're in the middle. The author's number of publications, number of citations, their affiliation rank, their location of where they're affiliated, where their university is, the journal impact factor where they're publishing, and the research fields. And so our pipeline is the following. We started with the 1.2 million papers in 2018. We predict the author gender of the authors. We expand the data using these 2 data sources. And then at the end, we end up with about 500,000 papers. Again, in 2018, 1.3 million authors and 7 million tweets. And our kind of unit of analysis is going to be this kind of pair of paper authors. So for each paper, we're going to kind of consider whether each of the authors is self-promoting or not. And so our unit of analysis is this kind of paper author pair. Okay, so the first question is there gender disparity in self-promotion? Let's start by just looking at the raw differences without any controls, just to get a sense for what the data looks like. So out of these 2.4 million pairs, what we see is that men account for 63% of them. And on average, they self-promote at a rate of 7.8, whereas women account for 36% of it, and they self-promote at a rate of 6.4%. So in the raw data, men tend to self-promote 22% more often than women. If we kind of break it up by different aspects, like let's say author position, so we look at middle versus last versus first, we see that this trend kind of continues, right? That men always tend to self-promote more. If we break it up by like research areas, we see that there are some differences, but again, this is pretty consistent where men tend to self-promote more. All right, so now let's get into some regressions where we actually can apply some of the controls that we can apply. So we're going to run a logistic regression where the outcome variable is does this author self-promote or not? And we're going to pay attention to the gender variable, but we're going to have a bunch of different controls. So we're going to control for things like prestige, so the rank of your affiliation, location, things like seniority, how many publications and citations you have, the author position, the journal impact, research fields, and then we're also going to add a paper random effects. And so now, after controlling for all this, if we look at the predicted self-promotion probability between male and female, we see that it's still there, and it's actually now 28% higher after applying the controls. There are several robustness tests that we also consider. So for example, all of this so far has been, I look at a paper author pair and I ask, did this author tweet or not? Now you could tweet about the paper if you're on Twitter, or you could not tweet about the paper even though you're on Twitter, or you could not tweet because you're not on Twitter. And right now we don't distinguish between whether you are on Twitter and chose not to tweet or whether you're just not on Twitter. Our rationale here is that, well, if you're not on Twitter, then by default you're choosing not to self-promote on Twitter, right? And so we're not sort of controlling for any for your kind of Twitter presence. Now, if we look at only among the authors who are on Twitter, and then now we additionally apply control for the follower account, because presumably there's an additional incentive to self-promote if you have lots of followers because you have a larger audience, then we get the same result. Right now, we're counting self-promotion as any tweet that is about your paper, that mentions your paper, whether it's an original tweet or whether it is that someone else tweeted and then you retweeted that tweet, we're still counting it as self-promotion. If we kind of separate those two and we look at only like retweets versus original tweets, we get the same trend. So this seems to be pretty robust to different kind of specifications of the model and different definitions of self-promotion. The next thing we wanted to do is to see if there are interactions between different things and the effect of gender on self-promotion, right? So for example, maybe if you think about journal impact factor, when the impact factor is lower, then maybe there's a gap on who chooses to self-promote and who doesn't. But when it's really high, then maybe the probability of self-promotion is so high because everyone is so excited about their paper in science or something like that, that like the gap, maybe it's much closer, right? And so like, are there interactions like this? And in the paper, we look at 4 different things. So your affiliation, academic discipline, the journal impact factor, and then the productivity of the authors, like how many publications or citations you had. Now for the talk, I'm just going to focus on these 2, just for the sake of time. And so let's starting with journal impact factor. So what we have basically is we've added an interaction term between gender and journal impact in the regression. And so now we can see the effect of, say, gender, here's female, on self-promotion, but now we can look at as well as kind of how it varies by journal impact factor. And so we see is that it's increasing, which makes sense because, again, the higher the impact factor, maybe the more excited you are about actually self-promoting. And again, like one hypothesis might be that the gap, when I haven't put the male curve here, but when I do, maybe the gap is like really high here, but maybe starts to kind of close when you get to higher impact factor, because at that point, then everyone is kind of like excited, right? But actually what we see is the opposite, right? So we see that the gap tends to be lower here, and then as the impact factor gets larger, then the gap actually grows, which is interesting and to some extent unexpected, at least when we're looking at this data. So like relative to men, women tend to self-promote their high impact papers less often. And one possible explanation is that this is due to even more fear about pushback for high achievements. And so this is something that we don't know the answer to, but it might be that it's something related to that, like additional fear of pushback for those higher achievements. Then if we look at author productivity and interaction with gender, we see the following. So here the gap between male and female tends to be pretty close across the board, so there doesn't seem to be a huge difference. However, what's interesting here is the shape of this curve. It ends up being nonlinear, and what happens is that for these kind of early career folks who have, like, you know, a small number of publications, the rate of self-promotion is lower, and then as people, you know, start to publish more, they tend to kind of self-promote more. But then afterwards, once they're, let's say, already established or very established at 136 publications, then they start to kind of decrease their rate of self-promotion. Maybe at that point there's less of an incentive, or maybe they're so busy that, you know, no time for tweeting or something like that, right? So when for this one, we see that mid-career scholars tend to self-promote more than those kind of on the ends of early and very late. And regardless of career stage, men tend to self-promote more than women. So that disparity continues to be there. All right, so for the last question on this paper is there a difference in the kind of return of self-promotion? So do women get more or less total mentions for self-promoting compared to men? So what we have here is a negative binomial regression where the outcome variable is the total number of mentions that the paper receives. And then we're going to be paying attention to the interaction between gender and self-promotion. So is the impact of self-promotion on the total number of mentions, does it vary by gender? And of course, we continue to have all the different controls. And what we find here is that actually women receive 5.4% more mentions than men when they self-promote. And so here's a chart. So for no self-promotion, you have lower total mentions than with self-promotion. And here's the kind of male and female differences. You can see for self-promotion, the female bar is slightly higher than the male bar. And again, like, so this 5.4% may not be a huge difference, but what we were thinking that it was possible that this bar, female bar, could be actually much lower than the male bar. And then that would explain maybe the lack of incentive for self-promotion, but it's not, right? It's actually slightly higher. Here again, we apply a bunch of robustness tests. So we again look at only among Twitter users, control for their number of followers, still get the same result. Look at only solo author papers in order to avoid this like complexity of the co-author. So maybe the co-author self-promotes and then another person retweets or whatever, self-promotes again, right? So if we kind of, that adds some complexity. So if we look at only solo author papers, we still see the same trend. We can also count, this is kind of something very nice about our metric, that it also tells us, mentions by scientists versus non-scientists. And so if we kind of consider them separately, still get the same result. And then finally, if we define self-promotion as tweets that came really quickly after the publication of the paper, like say within a day, we still get the same result. So it seems to be robust to multiple specifications as well. Okay, and then finally, and this one will be faster, promise, is the information retention in multi-platform sharing of science. So here the question is, paper gets published, and it starts to get picked up by the news media, but people start mentioning it on Twitter. And what happens is you get these like bursts of attention. The paper gets these bursts of attention in different platforms. And what we want to know is, as the sequence of bursts occur, is the text that's showing up in these mentions becoming more or less similar to the original paper? Or are the key things that were showing up, the key phrases that showed up in the paper, still showing up, or they tend to kind of go away as more bursts occur, right? So here's a kind of pipeline for this analysis. What we do is we start with the abstract, and then we find key phrases, ranked key phrases from the abstract using a summarization technique called text rank. And we actually used a couple of them to see if they give us different results. And so we now have these like key phrases, ranked key phrases from the abstract. Then we identify these bursts of mentions of the paper and like social media, blogs, news, Wikipedia, and so on. And then we measure basically whether these key phrases are showing up in that text online or not, right? So we have this measure that basically says, okay, sum up the ranks of the abstract key phrases that were found in that online text and divide by the sum of all the abstract key phrases. Now, this measure is something we came up with. It's very simple, but it's something that had not been tested before. So we actually, in the paper, we actually tested by asking experts in this research areas to kind of score these online text by how much retention it has. And then we compare with this score, and we see that there's pretty good agreement. So it seems to work well. And so now we can apply it, and we can ask, for example, to what extent different platforms tend to have higher or lower information retention. And here we find that blogs tend to be pretty high, where news tend to be a little bit lower, but not as low as, say, social media like Twitter and Facebook. Whereas Wikipedia, I mean, I wouldn't pay too much attention to Wikipedia. We don't have that many mentions in Wikipedia, so this is a bit noisy, but it tends to be blogs, then followed by news media, followed by social media. The next thing we can ask is, as I was saying, like what happens over time as more bursts occur? Is the retention getting higher or lower? And so here is like looking at only papers that had exactly 2 bursts. For them, the total retention, this is kind of irrespective of platform, tends to be lower in the second burst than in the first burst. So the second bursts tend to start to kind of deviate from the original paper. And what happens if we look at papers that had 3, 4, 5, 6 bursts? We see kind of a similar trend where, as time goes by, more bursts occur, the retention tends to be lower and lower. So we're always see this kind of decrease in information retention over time. And it is, well, if you kind of look more deeply into data, you cannot see this from this chart, but what you can see is that it's mostly driven, or in part driven, by social media posts coming in later in the trajectory of attention and bringing down the kind of retention. As we saw, social media tends to have lower information retention, so that's kind of in part what explains the trend. All right, so let me conclude with a slide with some summaries and takeaways. And I'll apologize in advance. This slide is very text heavy, but I thought this would be a good way to kind of end and have it all on the screen if you have questions. So first, with the kind of retraction paper, right? So we found that retracted papers get more attention than non-retracted papers across different platforms, and that these retractions don't impact the online attention to papers because they tend to come too late. By the time they come, papers have already kind of exhausted the attention they were going to get. And so kind of takeaways from here. First, I mean, science is dynamic and self-correcting. We know that. But we also need to be really aware of this and be open and willing to change our beliefs as new discoveries are made. So we need to be aware that these retractions may be coming. And, with the current kind of speed at which we consume content, some paper comes out and we read it, everyone reads it, talks about it, and then very quickly we move on from it. We may forget to that we may need to check to see if that paper is still valid, if it hasn't been retracted, or there hasn't been other papers that maybe have shown that maybe things are not what they kind of appear to be in that original paper. So we need to be really aware of this, and also we need to teach the public and non-scientists to also be aware of this, and to be kind of very mindful of the fact that things are always changing, right? Even though information kind of comes and goes so quickly on the web. The second one is, the second takeaway is that, these retractions, of course, they're a very important tool for correction, but they tend to have limitations. And so one of the limitations that we find here is that they don't seem to do much in terms of kind of curving the attention to a paper, just because the attention and the retractions are kind of happening at 2 different time scales, right? So the attention is coming and going really quickly, whereas retractions naturally take more time. And so at the very least, we should just be aware that retractions aren't working for that purpose, and so we may need to find other ways of addressing that issue. And maybe the other potential direction is that we need to think of ways of making that retraction process more efficient. Although this is complicated because, again, retractions shouldn't be taken lightly, and there needs to be a very robust and efficient and thorough process to get there. And so speeding them up is not necessarily an easy thing to do. For the second paper, we see that men tend to engage in online self-promotion more often than women, and that the return of self-promotion is slightly larger for women, which again sort of suggests that one of the ways that we can think about closing the total attention gap between male and female's work is by trying to close this self-promotion gap. And so how do we get there? Well, we think that we need to create environments that can empower and support women to self-promote their work. And then finally, the work on information retention shows that this information retention tends to vary across different platforms, and that this retention tends to decay over time. Now, this doesn't show in any way that the decay means that there's misinformation, right? So one way to explain this is that maybe later bursts tend to talk about the paper in the context of something else, not in the context of summarizing what's on that paper. So that not necessarily that is saying something like false about the paper, but this information decay does say that if we're really interested in knowing what's on the paper, we may be, a bit more skeptical about discussions that we see online, particularly, if it's been a while since the paper got published, and we may always want to go back to the original source and check what's there. And so, yeah, with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Hi, great, Daniel. Great presentation. Thank you so much. So let's give a round of virtual applause to Daniel, and let's just take questions. We have a good 5 to 7 minutes of time. And please, if you can also mute yourself and perhaps show your camera, that would be best. So Meijun, it looks like you had a question.
I'm just reading the chat here.
So I guess your question was, can high online attention to retracted papers before its retraction come for? Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, there are kind of two ways to think about these finding about why retracted papers tend to have more attention than non-retracted papers before the retraction. And so one way to think about it is, of course, that, well, maybe these retracted papers tend to be more flashy. So that's why they're getting more attention, because they're maybe intentionally or unintentionally written in a more flashy way that just captures more attention. It could also be that there's always these bias in science where unexpected things tend to be preferred by journals, by reviewers, right? And so if I make a mistake, right, and my mistake sort of randomly takes me to the kind of less surprising or more surprising side of things, well, the more surprising side of things is going to be preferred and more, easier to publish, right? And so this bias tells us that, when I make a mistake, that the mistake that takes me there is going to be more likely to lead to a publication, and it's also going to be, more interesting to people, and so there maybe captures more discussion. So that's kind of one direction, right? Of course, there's the other direction, which is what you suggest here, which is that, well, papers that get no attention probably aren't getting retracted a whole lot because no one sees them, no one cares, right? And so this increase in attention also leads to more scrutiny of the paper, and maybe that's the process by which they get retracted. So certainly, like, the causal direction is not, it's not necessarily.
Sorry, it seems that Meijun, are you trying to say something? Good, go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
Yeah. So I was just saying that, like, the causal direction could go in either way, and we're not actually sort of making a claim that it goes in one or the other. We're just kind of showing that, well, these papers do get more attention. But there's certainly a good point.
So questions. So do you have access to the text? I guess I like your second suggestions that retractions are like this important tool, but people feel there's this huge shame that goes with retractions. But I think maybe it should be, maybe no retraction, but like this self-correction should be part of the publication process. So do you have access to the retraction notices and look at maybe what they are like? I guess if they're more careful, maybe they have like or they explain, they made a mistake, an honest mistake, and versus like, okay, we retract this paper, we don't explain why. Do you think there are differences there? Because there are some retractions that are legitimate, like they made a mistake, but there are others like very, very dodgy.
Yeah, there are different reasons for the retraction. Like there's a mistake, or there's like data fabrication, or there is they're like the questions are on novelty. Maybe they're like actually just copying some type of like plagiarism, basically. And so yes, we do have access to some of that data. It's not as clean, and so we actually don't use it for this work, but it is a direction that we're thinking about. And in particular, it would be interesting to see if these differences in attention that we pay to the retraction papers actually varies by the reason of the retraction. So you would imagine that maybe data fabrication would be the type of retraction that actually leads to the surprising, more interesting findings than, say, plagiarism, right, or something like that. But yeah, so that's certainly something we've thought about doing, and we didn't do it yet for this work, but it is kind of like the next question down the line. Yes. So there's a question in chat: is some sentiment analysis performed on mentions or replies? So no, there's no sentiment analysis. The reason why is that I mean, I guess presumably your question is sort of getting at, you know, are these mentions and replies saying nice things or bad things about the paper? And so we tackle that question by actually going in and actually labeling each of the tweets as critical or non-critical to the paper, which I could see how maybe sentiment could be a proxy for that, but we felt like, well, one, we felt like this was not good enough, and two, we actually tested some of that and it wasn't working very well, just because the sentiment lexicons, for example, Luke, they tend to have words that sometimes show up as like part of the title of the paper, right? And so it just doesn't give a good enough signal of whether there's critical versus non-critical you know, sentiment in the tweet. And so we actually instead go in and actually manually check whether there's critical or non-critical mentions. But if that's not the reason why you asked the question about sentiment, then let me know, because that's how I'm kind of interpreting your question. Okay, great.
Okay, no worries, Major. So thank you so much, Daniel, again, for your wonderful presentation, and very exciting series of papers that I encourage everybody to read. Of course,